This lecture will explore some of the developments and back and forth in politics during the Gilded Age. So one of the biggest political, problems, one of the biggest things that people were arguing about was something called patronage, and it's shown really, really well if we just look at what happened to President James Garfield. President James Garfield was the 20th president of the United States. He started off in 1880. That's when his term started, and he didn't believe in the spoils system. He didn't believe that you should be able to, as a president, go around and hand out government jobs to everyone who was loyal to you, and loyal to you in like your political party or whatever. So you wouldn't be able to replace all Republicans with Democrats if you were a Democratic candidate or vice versa. And so what ended up happening is he didn't believe in that, and other candidates did. One of the candidates that did believe in this spoils system was actually his vice president, Zachary Taylor. And so there was a man who wanted a job, and he was asking for it, and James Garfield wasn't going to give it to him. And so he thought he would be better off having a chance to get a job if the vice president, Zachary Taylor, was the president. So he shot him. He shot the president. He shot President Garfield on July 2nd, 1881, not very long into his time as president. And President Garfield died about 2 weeks later. So this was obviously pretty extreme, but again, this was about one of the biggest issues of the day, which was this idea of patronage or the spoils system. A lot of Americans believe that patronage, the spoils system, was something that made the government corrupt and inefficient. So you had these new people who would come into the job. They might not be the most qualified, they might not be the best, they're just the most loyal to them. And also, you never get really good at your job because you're constantly being replaced by someone every time there's a new political party in office for the presidency. So really, this rewarding of supporters by giving them government jobs, it just made the government worse, less effective. Over this feud, over this idea of patronage, the Republican Party split. And really it split into three different ways. So Rutherford B. Hayes, we talked about him as president before. He, in 1877, tried to end patronage by firing a bunch of officials who had been given jobs just because of their support, and then replacing them with these reformers, these people that wanted to end patronage. And what ended up happening is the Republican Party split. And so it split three ways into stalwarts, which are people that supported patronage, so wanted to be able to put these people into new jobs, and the half-breeds, which were people that backed some reform but not complete. You still wanted to be able to use patronage sometime. And then there were reformers who completely wanted to end patronage and have government jobs be something that are based completely on how good you are, not on which side you support. And Garfield's assassination was the thing that finally turned the public opinion, turned the people's attention towards this, and said, you know what, patronage is a bad thing. And so they decided that they wanted to reform it. And so the very first step in that was the Pendleton Civil Service exam in 1833. And this is essentially that government jobs were going to be given based on these competitive written exams that were kind of difficult to do and showed your qualifications and abilities within the government jobs. So instead of being given a job just based on what political party you were given a job based on how qualified you were within the government. So that was obviously, I think, a much better system, but some people did not agree with that at the time. And really, it didn't make a huge change because right away when this started, only about 10% of the federal jobs fit into this category. But over time, the percentage increased. And so today, for many government jobs, you do have to take a civil service exam. So the election of 1884 happened, and this pitted Grover Cleveland, the Democratic candidate, against James G. Blaine, the Republican candidate. Grover Cleveland was the governor of New York. He was a reformer, and he was seen as an honest person. So he was one that maybe wanted to get rid of patronage. We're not 100% sure. This was more of a Republican issue, but yeah, he was seen as a very honest person, and eventually he would win this and become the 22nd president of the United States. But James G. Blaine was his opponent, a Republican, and he was a former Speaker of the House, and he was rumored to have taken bribes. And so people were so upset with the dishonesty of James G. Blaine that a group of Republicans supported Grover Cleveland instead. And these were Republicans known as the Mugwumps, which was an Algonquin word for that means great chief. And so these Republicans, they supported Cleveland. They expected Cleveland to come in and eliminate patronage because he was such a reformer. And a lot of the Democratic supporters of Cleveland wanted jobs, but he kind of chose a middle route. And so this middle course where he didn't give the jobs to his buddies, but also didn't do much to change the patronage system that was in place, kind of really made both sides kind of angry rather than helping out his cause and making either side happy. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint number 1. Soon, the issue of patronage was replaced by some of the big economic issues of the time. And the first one was kind of corporations and how they were being treated. These big corporations were able to pay lower amounts for a lot of different things. They could buy and ship much larger amounts, and so they got, a discount for having more quantity, for having more. And so they were able to pay lower rates to ship their goods, to buy goods, to do all of these things than average people or small businesses. And so a lot of people saw that as unfair advantage for these giant corporations. And so a lot of laws were passed state by state to regulate railroads and say, your prices can only be this and you have to do this, whatever different regulations they wanted to do. And so, after all of this was happening, and many of these states had them, Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railway versus Illinois court case came through. And it set the precedent that only the federal government can regulate interstate trade. So saying states can't do that because it's between two states, so only the federal government can actually do that. And there was a lot of pressure for the federal government to do that, so the Congress did put together the Interstate Commerce Act, which was the first federal law to regulate interstate commerce. Okay, another big issue was tariffs. Democrats wanted them lowered so that they could make goods cheaper and avoid trade wars. Republicans wanted them to stay the same so they could protect American industry. And the Democrats did pass tariff reductions. The Democratic House did, but the Republicans were still in charge of the Senate, and they quickly voted that down and rejected that bill. So even though the president had proposed it and the Democratic House had put it through, the Republican Senate said no to that particular bill. So as the Republicans were taking back power and getting a majority in more places, they decided to take some action on it. And so one of the things that they did was the McKinley tariff. So they wanted to push through with what they felt was the right thing to do with tariffs. And so the McKinley tariffs lowered taxes and lowered some tariffs in some places, but then raised them on other products to try to protect American industry. Really what this did is it kind of failed very epically, and it caused the prices of all the goods to go up very, very quickly because of, later on trade wars and things like that. The Sherman Antitrust Act is another thing that the Republicans were able to make happen. And basically what that did is it took away power from the trusts, and some of the language from it, I've kind of changed the language just a little bit and summarized it. It prohibits, so it doesn't allow the combination or conspiracy of business in restraint of trade from state to state or multi-states, whatever. Okay, and so it basically says you can't come together in a way that takes away from free trade, that takes away from companies' abilities. There were also some new ideas in politics which led to whole new political parties. And one of those ideas was populism. This is it led to the populist or the People's Party. And this was a movement put together basically to increase the power of farmers. All right, so this was a party mostly for farmers. And the reason why it happened is because soon after the Civil War, all of this new technology that we've talked about in the last couple of units really started to mean that they were able to make more crops. And every single farmer was able to make more crops. But because they were able to make more, it didn't necessarily mean they made a whole lot more money. Because the increase in supply made the prices go down. All right, so as there was more and more stuff in the market, you could get it for cheaper and cheaper. And so that was a problem. Another problem that made this political party came up was that these giant banks had mortgages out on these farms, and if the farms couldn't pay them back, they were taking that land from them. They were taking their homes and their farms from them. And also, the increased shipping costs had made costs of farming go up. So they weren't making as much money on each thing, and it was costing more because those railroads were very expensive to move their grain and different food items on. And so, what was happening at this time, and the reason for this was because of inflation. Inflation is the decline in the value of money caused by an increase in the money supply. So, if there's more money out there, or it can be for other reasons as well, the value of your money goes down. That means that prices of everything go up and you're making the same amount of money. So a dollar is just not worth as much as it used to be because the prices are so much more for the goods. Okay. And so after the Civil War, there were all kinds of different monies around that we had kind of talked about before. There were gold and silver coins. There were national banknotes that were, promised to be paid back by the government in government bonds. And then there were these greenbacks, and these greenbacks were not really backed by anything. I mean, they just weren't. Um, they weren't. They were just a paper currency. Okay, and so they were this kind of inflating, really big increase in the money supply. And to fight this inflation and this increased money supply, the government stopped greenbacks and paid back the banknotes that were in those national banknotes. And then soon they even stopped making silver coins. So the total supply of money was just going to be the amount of gold or gold coins that they had. And so this, restriction of the money supply, making the money supply smaller, caused deflation. Deflation is when prices go down. So that is an increase in the value of money and therefore a decrease in the prices. So with way less money around, everything had to cost a little bit less. And so the farmers then had to sell their crops for less, and they had to borrow money for supplies to plant the new crop. And so they had bought their products and stuff at inflated prices, and then they had to sell them at the lower deflated prices. So that was bad for the farmers. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint number 2. So the farmers further put together their power when the Department of Agriculture in 1866 asked Oliver H. Kelly from Minnesota to tour the rural South and report on farmers' conditions. And so basically, he just said, how are the farmers doing? Why don't you go in and check, tour around the South? And he came back and said, you know what the problem is? Farmers are very isolated. They're very much on their own, and they don't have, social organization. They don't know, they just don't have this connection to other people, which they need. And so he formed something called the Patrons of Husbandry in 1867, and later it became known as the Grange. Now, the Grange was this great social connection where people could get together and have dances and do different, craft fairs or whatever, all these different wonderful things, and just kind of get together and see each other and have that social connection. But it developed into a political powerhouse because it brought these farmers together to be able to fight for the changes that they needed in the country. And so in 1873, a big recession came through the country, and farm income went down really, really fast. And so the Grange, took action. They started to try and change things. They pressured states to further regulate railroads that were moving the farm products, as well as warehouses that were storing them, to bring down prices so that farmers could afford to survive. And then it also brought farmers together to create cooperatives. And a cooperative is where the members of this cooperative, so all of these different farmers, work together to increase their own prices by selling in large amounts, okay, as well as to lower their costs by buying products, from each other. And so they would do that, or they would bring a whole big group together and sell all of their products at once and ship them and put them in warehouses so they could pay the warehouses and the trains, the railroads, those same rates that these big corporations were paying, because they had these large amounts, just like the corporations. Okay, and so that was a beneficial thing for the farmers to be able to do, and the Grange helped make that happen. And so a lot of these farmers were together, and they realized that the Grange had some power, and that their alliances that they were trying to build had some power, and they kind of wanted to exercise it, but they felt like the only way they could exercise this power was through politics. And so they didn't really trust the Republicans or the Democrats, so they thought, well, let's get a list of demands together, and let's go to the Democrats and the Republicans, and we'll just vote for whichever one agrees to do what we want them to do. But then in July of 1892, a bunch of delegates got together, 1,000 delegates. They met in Omaha, Nebraska, and they ended up forming a whole new party, the Populist Party, or the People's Party. And so the People's Party, they nominated a presidential candidate. They nominated James B. Weaver to run for president, and he ran under the platform that he wanted all of these things. He wanted unlimited coinage of silver, so that would cause, if you had silver become part of the money now, if we had free silver, that would cause inflation, which would functionally make the debts lower of these NHL, or of these farmers, and then it would also make their prices go up, so they would get paid more later on, which would be nice. And the other thing that they tried to get to happen was a federal ownership of the railroads, and then also, so the government owning the railroads, also graduated income tax, which a graduated income tax is kind of what we have right now. It basically is a tax where different levels of income are taxed at different levels. So if you have higher income, you have to pay a higher percentage of your money to the government. And then to help try to get people in the cities on their side, they included some of these labor ideas, which is an 8-hour workday, and restrictions on immigration and stuff like that these city people wanted. And so what ended up happening is a lot of urban people, a lot of city people still didn't vote for them, didn't really care for them. And so the Populist Party, the People's Party, ended up lacking any real big amount of power. And so the Populist Party tried to also, they tried to flex their muscles a little bit in the election of 1896. The Populist Party thought that the Democrats and the Republicans both would want the gold standard. So they knew that the Republicans would want the gold standard, want to keep that together and keep the money supply from getting larger and therefore inflating the prices. However, they thought that Grover Cleveland would be the Democratic candidate, and that he would also endorse the gold standard, and so they could get some of those Democrats on their side to vote for them, with the free silver as the main thing that the main issue that they were going to win on. However, what ended up happening is that the Democratic National Convention, William Jennings Bryan supported free silver, right? And he gave this big impassioned speech called I believe it was called the Cross of Gold speech, where he said, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Big, strong speech, and he became the Democratic candidate. William McKinley was the Republican candidate. He said that the employers, the businesses, warned that if you don't vote for McKinley, the businesses are going to fail. If you have these massive amounts of inflation because of free silver, the businesses will fail under William Jennings Bryan. And McKinley was kind of moderate. He was kind of in the middle on issues of labor issues, and he was also fine with immigrants, which brought a lot of those people in that were voting. And so a lot of people in the cities voted for McKinley, and you could see the countries, the country areas voted blue. They voted for William Jennings Bryan, and so McKinley won by quite a bit. He won a very decisive, large victory, and the outcome of this was not only that the Republicans had another president, but also that the Populist Party kind of went away and lost all of its power. Take a moment to write out 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any questions, then create 3 test questions that you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.